my experience, I will say that I have seen my fair share of bad prologues or prologues that aren't really necessary or prologues that are misleading without being invested in any of the characters or the story in general. The reader doesn't know what to feel or who to care about. Think of what message you're sending the reader. You're going from high stakes, high investment, and high tension to absolutely none. I think at its core, there's nothing really wrong or inherently bad about prologues. You really want to use these opening pages, build investment into your characters and the story. Prologues. I've asked people on both Twitter and here in the community tab what people think of them, and I've gotten mixed responses. But to be honest, I expected that. Prologues are honestly pretty divisive. When we see them in every great science fiction and fantasy book, we often want to emulate that and include prologues in our own writing. I think at its core, there's nothing really wrong or inherently bad about prologues. They, as a literary device, are fine, and when done well, they can have profound effects. But there's a problem. In my experience, I will say that I have seen my fair share of bad prologues or prologues that aren't really necessary or prologues that are misleading, or any other combination of that. I feel like it's a rite of passage for every science fiction and fantasy writer to write a bad prologue. I myself have done that, but I've learned. I've helped with slush piles, and I've edited works for many writers, and I think I've picked up on a few things that might be the problem with prologue. And hopefully too, we can laugh later on at some of our bad prologues, or maybe we can fix what might be wrong with them in the first place. Also, it should go without saying, but I feel like these kinds of disclaimers need to be said. If you've done any of these points, it doesn't necessarily mean that your prologue is bad, or that I won't like your prologue, or that I don't like your writing. Different prologues and tropes under the correct set of circumstances or in front of the correct audience can often work. This is merely a warning, or at least a gentle nudge to examine your own writing, or perhaps to start the conversation if you've never had pushback or someone examine your work before. And the reason why prologues and knowing when to use them, when not to use them, is so important is because the first pages of your book are the most important. They are what will hook whatever reader picks them up at a bookstore or might lead to an agent continuing with your query letter. If you're new here, my name is Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and the creator of Wrestling with Word, a channel where we look at how we can tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. How often have we heard the writing advice that you need to start with the action, to jump into the exciting part of your story and get going? This is among some of the most common writing advice out there. And it's not entirely wrong, but starting within an action sequence, a battle, or a fight, or even an argument, and this goes for within a prologue or not, without any context or without establishing the stakes, often leaves the reader feeling lost and confused. The reader should understand what is at stake and needs to be given a reason to care about what is happening on the page. Without being invested in any of the characters or the story in general, the reader doesn't know what to feel or who to care about. Instead of starting your prologue by jumping right into the action, consider instead if time can be dedicated to developing your characters and slowly building to some action point within that first chapter or prologue. And if you wish to include that action sequence in your prologue, you may need to sacrifice some of the action to developing characters and making the reader care about what is happening and who it is happening to. This type of trope in prologues might have been more popular back in the day or in the earlier era of fantasy and science fiction. I imagine we've all seen this done in Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings. But the difference there is that the established fan base already had a contextual idea of who all of those characters are and what is going on. Similar to point 1, starting off hot in the midst of an action sequence, then transitioning to chapter 1, where our main character is waking up, working on a farm, or going about their normal, mundane day, can give the reader the wrong impression. Think of what message you're sending the reader. You're going from high stakes, high investment, and high tension to absolutely none. And worse yet, the reader might start flipping the pages, trying to get back to the next scene that contains some bit of action. They may feel whiplashed between these two competing emotional states. If this sounds like something that might happen for your own prologue or in your own book, re-examine your opening. Sometimes the biggest problem that I find with writers' work is that they are starting the story in the wrong place. If you feel like your chapter 1 opening is too mundane or too slow, so you include an action-packed prologue, the first thing you should do is to rethink your first chapter. Rethink where the story should be starting and try to make your true opening, chapter 1, instead open just before the hook of your story. You really want to use these opening pages to build investment into your characters and the story. One thing we can do is to think of what the mundane is or your point of view character and then disrupt it. Add some sort of obstacle. This doesn't have to be your hook, nor does it have to really matter in the main plot or primary subplot. Consider this more of something that would disrupt their day, like being out of milk or running an errand, as opposed to working on the family farm and then finding a magical item or something. This sin might actually be the most forgivable and sometimes is actually a trope that some readers enjoy. An example that we can see this high level of action that then transfers to the slow and mundane life is looking at a book like Aragon. In this YA fantasy novel, we start with a battle in the woods following a shaded protagonist that ends literally in flames and then opens to Aragon, a simple farm boy traveling and hunting in the woods. I would advise going against this, as we are creating emotional whiplash and there still isn't an investment in those characters or in that high level of action in our hot opening. This one you might have the most flexibility. The problem with starting with a character that isn't your main point of view character, or one of your point of view characters, is that the reader is often left with the feeling of, why did I just read this? Is this character going to matter? If this character wasn't important enough to be a primary one, what other information is or isn't important? Essentially, you're going to be eroding your reader's trust when doing this. They've already trusted you enough to pick up the book. Now they have begun to read the first pages only to find out that the character that they're reading about doesn't even play a role later on in the story. At the start of your story, the readers are going to be primed to pay attention to who is in each scene and what is going on. Starting with an irrelevant side character or very minor side character that doesn't really play that much of a role into your story isn't useful when trying to establish trust and maintain your reader's attention. There are a lot of exceptions when it comes to this rule, but those exceptions are deliberately done and are essential most often to the main plot. One exception of this done correctly is in Leviathan Wakes, The Expanse, Book 1. Although we start from Julie Moe's perspective and never see it again, the prologue doles out important information for us to understand the mystery as well as establish the central conflict of the story. This prologue really sets up the questions that are answered later on. This is perhaps one of my personal pet peeves. Simply put, there are better ways to world build and establish our setting than dishing them all out during a prologue. Extensive world building on page 1, or building grand narratives and historical retellings right out of the gate, will probably make your story more passable than any other point on this list. Not only that, or I guess in the best case scenario, is that they just skip past the prologue entirely. My advice would be to cut this opening altogether. What we can do, however, is find excerpts that are the most important, or at least the most important things that your reader may find interesting or that are important to the story, and try to find a way for this information to come up naturally in your narrative and in ways that are relevant to your character. I talk about a similar subject in my video on The Last of Us and world building, and how it is important to slowly administer this information and that we need to make it relevant to the point of view character. This is something that I will go into more detail later on, but in short, consider how your world, its history, and everything else about your setting is important in relation to your point of view characters, as well as the plot or theme. We all pick up and see the world differently, and so do all your point of view characters. Similar to my third point, except this might be a bit more sinful when it comes to the mistakes made regarding your prologue. Changing the voice or the point of view between your prologue and your first chapter, as an example, going from third person to first person, is not only distracting, but it really breaks immersion as well. Again, it is important that you use these opening pages to establish the tone of your story as well as your own authorial voice. This is the chance to hook your reader and set the stage for what it is that they are about to read. A good example, though, of an exception to this rule, and there are exceptions to every rule, is in the 5th season, book 1, the prologue titled You Are Here. Now, despite this prologue being written in second person, the novel does maintain this changing point of view throughout the story and throughout the trilogy. But for the first book's prologue, we are not only given context for the story, the tone and style are clearly established. If you're interested in seeing this prologue done really well, I would suggest reading the 5th season, book 1. With all that being said, there are plenty examples of prologues having been written and having worked, even within the context of some of these points. A good thing to kind of keep in mind, and one thing that I always ask writers, or even ask myself if I want to write a prologue, is why is this a prologue and not chapter 1? Or what purpose does this prologue serve? Also, keep in mind that any book that you see on the bookshelf at a bookstore has likely gone through a great deal of vetting, editing, and revisions. So a perfect book that is on the shelf with a prologue might have received a great deal of grooming, or had some of these points present in an earlier draft. And more to this point, don't look at the famous or multi-published authors as the example of what should be done. If George R.R. Martin and Stephen King all used all 5 of these points, I guarantee you their readership wouldn't go down. They have earned the trust of their consumer already. They have built a reputation for telling great stories. Most of us, or at least what I think most of us, are still in the early stages of our writing career, trying to find representation to become traditionally published, or navigating the world of self-publishing. Similarly, a fantasy book or any sort of book that is in the bookstore that doesn't have a prologue may have had a prologue in an earlier draft and could have been cut for any one of these reasons. No one book is the same, and we should always operate in the context of what makes our story the best story it can be. I'm curious to hear what you think of prologues. Do you use them? Do you feel a similar way? How do you feel when a book opens to a prologue? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, let me know what you're wrestling with. I'm always curious to hear back from you on the things that you're working on, as well as the things you might be struggling with. If you stuck around for this long, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.